world's climates have always been changing. There are times when the world has been warmer. There are times when the world's oceans have been higher and more acidic. So what have we got to worry about, and where's the proof really? Well, the answers to that are all of that is true, but never when human beings have lived the way we live has the world been as warm or on a trend as fast to become warmer. And the impacts on our climates and our living environments are changing at a pace that we can barely understand. So I think the important argument is to move away from the science of climate change into what you deal with in your lives every day, which is the political reality of how do we reduce our impact and live with the consequences of what we have already caused. So the causes are also real. On the next slide, there is a reminder that the impacts of a warmer, wetter, windier, and places drier world are already being felt around the world and in New Zealand. As a local government, you are at the front line of dealing with the impacts of climate change on your communities. So we don't need to dwell on the evidence, but there are some positive things we can reflect on. On the next slide, we observe substantial increases in the funds that are being invested in renewables energy technologies. Substantial amounts recently have gone into the development of cost-effective solar technologies to harness energy from the sun. Further investments are well underway in harnessing the power of wind, and much lesser investments are being made in other renewables. The good news is that the technologies that we know of today can substantially reduce emissions in the near future. The challenge is not a technological one, it is much more an economic and political one. We move to the next slide, we can talk a little about what we might do to make things happen in New Zealand. The first and most important thing for all of us, whether it's individuals, households, businesses, local government or central government, is to know where your emissions are coming from. You cannot manage what you do not measure. In addition, we do need a coordinated effort. No one of us acting alone, no small group acting on its own is going to be able to make a material difference to our emissions or indeed to adapt to the impacts of climate change. The coordination of efforts, the collaboration, partnership, participation and collective action are all going to be critical. Further, by providing investors with predictability about a pathway to transition to a climate resilient, low emissions economy will enable the private sector to direct its capital in anticipation of capital protection and rates of return that will support the collective action of governments and organisations. So to help create some degree of certainty, our elected leaders, without dissent, passed legislation late last year which did a number of things. It set in domestic legislation targets for the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and by 2050. And without sketching out all the detail of the percentages, the anchor years, and the two gas buckets, it would be fair to say at least now we have some measurable targets against which to assess policy propositions and our direction of travel. Secondly, the legislation requires the government to commit to emissions budgets, each of which covers a 5-year emission period, and sets up a process for the establishment of the first 3 of those 5-yearly budgets. It requires a national risk assessment, the first of which was released earlier this week, prepared by the Ministry for the Environment, and subsequently the Climate Change Commission every 6 years will provide a revised set of risk assessments of the impacts of climate change on New Zealand. The legislation also requires the development of the National Adaptation Plan, a responsibility handed to the Ministry for the Environment, but the Climate Change Commission has the obligation to monitor progress against that plan once adopted. So the roles and responsibilities are quite clear, but the opportunity exists for significant progress. The next slide shows the first set of emission, the next one after that one, shows the steps of emissions reductions. Now this is a stylized presentation about how we might think about our pathway to our targets by 2050. And the budgets that will be prepared for 2025, the period to 2030, and the period to 2035 need to be put out for public consultation by the 1st of February next year, finalised by the 31st of May, and either adopted as recommended or amended and then adopted by the government of the day by the end of next year. Those budgets will also be supported by an emissions reduction plan, which is the advice to the government about pathways that would enable it to achieve the budgets that have been recommended. So the next slide shows how the Commission fits in to the institutional arrangements. The first thing to remember is that the Commission is not all things climate change. We have a specific set of responsibilities to prepare advice. We have no decision rights. To prepare advice for the government of the day on emissions reduction budgets and plans consistent with our statutory targets and international obligations. We are required to consult before presenting our advice to the government, and we are required, once an emissions reduction plan has been adopted, to monitor progress and report to the government of the day and to the public of New Zealand on progress towards achieving that plan. To reiterate the timelines, the next slide shows where the focus of the Commission's work is right now. And that is in seeking input, evidence, to form an opinion about those first reduction budgets and the emissions reduction plan. Our resources are fully committed to achieving those objectives first by the 1st of February for the formal presentation of advice for consultation and for the finalisation of that advice by the 31st of May. On the next slide, we remind ourselves that these things sit in a certain context. The New Zealand government, both the present one and the one that will be formed after our election, is clearly challenged by the circumstances of the pandemic as it manifests itself around the world and in New Zealand today. And the 2020 budget presented by the government caused the Climate Change Commission to write to the Minister for the Environment and strongly advocate that where funding is going to be allocated to stimulate the domestic economy, it should be done so looking at spending through the climate change lens that we wrote to the Minister for Climate Change about in April. I'll come back a little to the 6 principles which we think are helpful for guiding higher level decisions about investment and spending. We also wrote to David Parker when the government was putting through its fast-track legislation for shovel-ready projects around the RMA. Again, advocating that where spending is being accelerated as a stimulus package, we must not forget the context of climate change that prevails today. The investment framework will be critical. The debt that we are taking on at central and local government will be inherited by future generations. It will represent an opportunity cost and opportunities lost unless we make sure it is matched by investments which are resilient to the impacts of climate change and best prepare us to move through reduced emissions pathways. On the next slide, I take the opportunity to outline the 6 principles that we wrote to the Minister for Climate Change about in April. The full letter is on our website. And I would encourage you as decision makers to think about this as a lens for how you might choose to make spending and investment decisions. The first one is to look at the world through the lens of a changing climate, to make sure we don't lock ourselves into high emissions pathways and make investments in assets which will be stranded or abandoned in the face of climate change. We should bring forward investments that of necessity we will have to make, particularly around infrastructure. And that infrastructure is often in the hands of local government. How we manage stormwater, drinking water and wastewater. How we protect our community assets that are near the seashore, riverbanks or lake edges. How we invest to protect ourselves when the weather may be drier in parts, wetter in other parts, and windier as well. Our third principle is to recognise that we need a labour force for the 21st century, and that some of your own initiatives to begin work on electrification of transportation will not only help reduce immediately the emissions from that transportation, but in adapting and adopting those technologies, you will be making a contribution to training the labour force of the future. So starting now, even if it's starting small, is making a contribution to the development of the skills that we will need to move at speed and scale in the coming decade. Our fourth principle is again to restate the need to work in partnership with iwi Māori, with research organisations, with our local communities, with central government and other agencies. The fifth principle reminds us that we must maintain the incentives to reduce emissions and adapt to climate change. The emissions trading scheme is but one set of such incentives, and those incentives will never be complete and can never do all of the work. But the incentives need to be real and effective in changing behaviours. And finally, we do need to change what we measure. That our fixation on measuring busyness in the form of gross domestic product counts a subset of things that matter to us. It counts those things that are monetized and traded and exchanged. We need to measure things that go to the heart of our well-being, our climate resilience, and the sustainability of the lifestyles that we live.
Oh, hallelujah.
A couple of slides to go. On the next slide, we remind ourselves that local government is at the forefront of the challenge of adaptation. That if we do not begin to act now, and I note that you are acting now, it will be too late. The question is the extent and pace of action that is required. I am sometimes asked why New Zealand needs to bother when our emissions are only 0.17% of global emissions. There are a number of answers to that question, apart from the fact that 30% of all emissions come from countries, each of which emits less than 1%. Apart from the argument that it is important for our legitimacy to play our part on the world stage, that we act locally to bear our share of the burden. It is also highly likely that the supply chains for fossil fuels will themselves become unstable and unreliable in the decades to come, and that choices about the sources of fossil fuels will become more limited, that the price is more volatile, and the impacts that they have on us more random. And the consequence of that is that for our own interests, we should move away from a dependence on high-emitting sources of energy. Finally, on the last slide, I address a topic that young people often raise with me. What can they do in a world where nihilism seems to be on the rise? I can't make a difference, the world is not listening, we're all cooked anyway. And I say to those young people, there are 4 things we can all do. Every time we buy anything, we are sending a signal to the supply chain of the world to put another one of those things back on the shelf so that we might buy next time, or somebody else might buy later today. Every time we purchase, we vote. We vote with our money, and we should do so mindfully. Secondly, we can all be advocates. We can all learn more and say our part in changing the behaviours of others through education and information. Thirdly, the vast majority of New Zealanders either work in or work for a business, an organisation, a not-for-profit, central or local government. We can all influence our employers to look at the way we work, what we produce and how we produce it, and change from within to reduce emissions and increase climate resilience. And of course, all those eligible to have the opportunity to vote for the leaders who can make a difference. And it is going to take all levels of government, business, and society to make the changes we need. So the long and the short of it, when we come to the end of the formal presentation, is that the Climate Change Commission has some very specific tasks which we are set out to do. We are not all things climate change, and I certainly would not expect that organisations such as yours would necessarily wait for advice, which is why I'm reassured to see that you are taking climate action informed by, but not waiting for, the evidence and contributions of others. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today, and I'm very happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Carr. Councillors, questions?
I sent him a question.
Oh, Dr. Carr, I understand that you've got some submitted questions. Do you have those, or?
No, I don't have them in front of me. So I'm happy if whoever has them wants to just read them out. And if your clever technical people want to throw me up on the screen instead of a slide, that would be good too.
You are up on the screen actually, but I'll put you on hold.
All right, here we go.
Well, Stephen will get it. Is Jane there?
I do remember one question, and I'll try and recall that one and go to it. And that was the question of what would my advice or the Commission's advice be to the Council about their actions, particularly adaptation. And I think we have to be a bit cautious here. The first thing is that the Commission's role is not really to provide advice to you about adaptation, but having sort of jumped aside from that question, I think from my own presentation you might take it that my view is that you need to be doing what you're doing, you need to be doing more of it, and you need to be doing it as fast as you can take your voters with you. By that I mean actions to demonstrate how to reduce your own carbon footprint are significant. They provide role model and leadership for businesses. That taking action when you make investments to make sure that the infrastructure you are building and protecting takes into account the real impact of climate change. The opportunity that might exist to ensure that your near-shore, riverbank, lakeside infrastructure is either adequately protected or, if unprotectable, is retreated, are important initiatives that you can take.
Thank you.
So,
Councillor Ness.
My question was around setting regional targets for carbon emissions.
Yeah.
Because nationally we've got a national target, and I understand that there will be possible policies and plans coming through from central government. If a policy is set that all regions have to have an emission target, I wonder whether the Commission has a view on how best to set a target at net zero, or build it up from the bottom, district by district, or set an aspirational regional target which is aligned to the national target. I just think that sooner or later government's going to tell us we've got to deliver up one of these region by region, and I would like to start.
I think that's a fair question, but let me just tease out why it may be quite problematic. The first thing is that New Zealand regions are very diverse, as well you know. Some are heavily urbanised, some are substantially rural, some have large afforestation, some have large dairy herds. The Department of Statistics, in its preparation of national inventories, along with the Ministry for the Environment, recently released data showing regional emissions, and it highlights just that diversity. Down in Southland, they've got the smelter at the moment, and the smelter emits 600,000 tonnes of CO2 a year just from the smelting process. So if the smelter turns off, Southland may look like it has had this extraordinarily effective way of reducing its emissions. But largely, whether the smelter stays or goes is not in the hands of the people or decision makers at Southland. So I think in understanding and measuring regional emissions, we can help build up a national picture. But I would think it could be very challenging to set emissions reduction standards by region. It's going to be challenging enough to set them by sector, for example, in process heat, or in energy generation, or in agriculture, and those are sort of nationwide sector assessments of reduction opportunities. how they will come together in a particular region will largely depend on the configuration of economic activity in that region. So I think there is a challenge here about what the sum of the parts in each region looks like and how much is actually under that region's control.
Councillor Eadie.
Kia ora, Dr. Carr, thank you for your presentation. My question is around the balancing of our adaptation and the mitigation. It seems that at this point we are investing and paying a lot of attention to our mitigation, which I understand we need to get emissions down. Is there a point where it seems that climate change is accelerating? Possibly, you know, that beyond, we don't really know, these things can get, seem to be accelerating. Is there a point where we will have to start investing more and paying more attention to adaptation? I'm thinking around food production, for example. As a council, we're always weighing up the balance of where we invest our money. Yeah. You mentioned about the collapse of the fossil fuel industry, and that'll affect our supply chains. We in Bay of Plenty, we have a very export-dependent economy in terms of our primary industries. Yeah. If we're looking at the collapse of fossil fuel, we're looking at the carbon footprint and the carbon mileage of our food. Yeah, that's my question. At what point do we start investing more in adaptation in terms of our food production, how we source it, and how we make our money?
So look, I think, first of all, that adaptation and emissions reduction can sometimes overlap. Let me just tease out a few. I think your question is a fair one, that for New Zealand, the cost of adaptation to the known impacts of climate change are going to run into the billions of dollars. Whether it's low-lying infrastructure, or whether it's need to move water to where agriculture needs it, or to move agriculture to where the water is, that the climate resilient economy is going to require very substantial investment. The emissions reduction opportunities that intersect with adaptation are of course interesting. For example, it may well be that there are new technologies which will enable renewable energy to produce, and that renewable energy may or may not also have the byproduct of creating electricity, for example, for the production of hydrogen, which may become one of the technologies for shipping in the future. Or we may find that there are technologies developed to reduce carbon emissions that themselves become sources of new economic activity and opportunity. Agriculture is a challenge given the way New Zealand has traditionally farmed our animals, right? The open pastures, the ruminant animals, and the methane emitted from that process. We compare that to opportunities for other agricultural producers who rely more heavily on animals in barns where their diet is heavily controlled, and food supplements that may be able to be genetically engineered to reduce methane emissions may already be available. And the challenge for New Zealand agriculture will increasingly not be about our production, it could be about our access to global markets. And that challenge will be, if there are lower emission ways of producing meat products, the world may choose to have them, even although we are still the least emitting form of the older technology. So New Zealand will need to invest in adaptation, but in the process of investing in emissions reduction, we will be positioning ourselves for a lower emission world.
Well, thank you, Dr. Carr. So we've got Councillor Winters, then Councillor Rose.
Where am I looking to? It's hard to find a question. So I'll just talk. So good morning, Dr. Carr. My name's Kevin Winters, and I represent one of 3 councillors from the Rotorua ward, Rotorua constituency. And I'm pleased you've got in your presentation this morning applying a climate change lens to our recovery. Because I was listening to a presentation by Grant Robertson this morning talking about our recovery from COVID, and he talks about an unemployment rate of around 4% nationally. However, in Rotorua, it is probably way more than that because of our reliance on tourism and the visitor industry. And it's really hard to have a conversation with your community when A, they've lost their job, B, the prospect of getting a job back again in Rotorua is grim because all the hotels have shut shop, the attractions have shut shop, the chances of them opening are very slim because our borders are closed. And so there's a real dilemma there of having a conversation to reduce your carbon emissions, yet the day-to-day running of that family, that whānau, is actually, I haven't got a job. The prospects of getting one are really small. Yep. So for it's really hard to have those conversations long-term. So secondly, I'm looking at we're using our lands differently to combat problems, aka nutrients and carbon dioxide through growing trees. We've got ETS schemes, which you said are incentives. We've got the Billion Trees program, which are incentives to encourage land use change. But yet it comes back to what Toy is saying, is our food production lands are getting less and less. So when you haven't got a job, and the prospects, and you're into that poverty cycle, the last thing you want is your food and vegetables to increase in price because the land use has changed so much that you can't afford good quality food. So there's a real dilemma there facing my community in terms of going forward. So food production is the real issue. And growing trees, you can't eat it. And I'm a former dairy farmer, and when you started talking about grasses for ruminants, yes, we have a low-cost dairy production system in New Zealand, grasses and sunshine, and it's outdoors, but yet there are new grass species being produced overseas for ruminants to uptake that are low methane producers. Import restrictions on genetically modified grasses. So the dairy industry is in a real dilemma. They want to do the right thing. They want to see species. Yeah. There's a whole lot of stuff there, Rod. It's a statement.
So I will take the opportunity because it is important. The first thing is, I absolutely agree and have an enormous amount of empathy for communities that are challenged by unemployment and that almost sense of hopelessness about, so when will it get better and why will it be better than it ever was? And I'm not going to say I've got a simple answer to that. I think that the mass market, high volume, low value tourism that saw New Zealand arrivals grow from 400,000 tourists in 1980 to 4 million in 2018 was unsustainable growth and probably had reached an unsustainable level. So we were going to have to confront what were we going to do about that anyway. And that was because of the environmental impact that volume of tourists were having on the very experience that those people were coming to share. The carbon footprint of aviation fuel is a significant problem, not because aviation is a large share, it's only about 3% of global emissions, but because it was growing so rapidly. And it is absolutely the case that offsetting your flight emissions by planting a tree is not a solution to the problem. We cannot plant our way out of this problem. We have to reduce gross emissions. So absolutely agree that one of the impacts of an ETS price around $50 an NZU, an impact on land use change that our communities may not desire. And as a consequence, whether it's through local government regulation of land use or whether it's through a modification of settings to the ETS, we do need to make sure we do not con ourselves into believing that we can plant our way out of this problem, because we can't. So I agree with you about that. When it comes down to GE, I mean, there are a range of things that New Zealanders have collectively chosen to allow or not allow. We do not allow nuclear power, and yet in some ways you could say it is a pathway to reducing carbon emissions. We are very reluctant to fluctuate lake levels to generate power. We are very reluctant to dam large bodies of flowing water. We are very reluctant to have windmills on the skyline anywhere near our landscapes that we value highly. We don't like solar arrays that look out over our chosen watch places. So New Zealanders are going to have to make some very hard choices to deal with the problem of both adapting to climate change and reducing our emissions. And it is the role of leaders to help people understand that there is no get out of jail free card. There is no free lunch or free pass. There are choices, fortunately. We do have options, but some of those options are about choice between two things, neither of which we would prefer. So on the dairying, I do think that the GE conversation is an important one, but I couldn't guarantee you how out on that call. We do know that there are feeds that emissions. The challenge is to find the equivalent way of dosing
what we say, where we work, and who we vote for young people. So I'm supposing you guys as a commission have this printed somewhere for young people to see. Obviously with the increase in young people actually getting involved in the climate change area and actually starting to look at it and take a serious thought of it.
We don't necessarily, because the interesting thing is education. We're not funded to do it. We are obviously funded to prepare advice for the government and the preparation of that advice to go out for consultation. But we do not have a mandate or funding to essentially advocate for climate change and climate action. That is the responsibility of our elected leaders.
Okay, and the second one is just in your own opinion, do you think that now is the time to start thinking further? So looking into our 50-year, 100-year kind of cycles rather than what we currently do where we're looking our more 1 year, 3 year, 10 year, maybe 20?
I think the answer is you have to do all of that. If they're looking out to 100 years is an excuse for not acting now, then that's a problem. But you are right in saying that the world doesn't stop in 2050. The world will go on. It's not going to be curtains, lights out, go home if we miss our targets. The challenge will be, is the harder we make it for ourselves by acting too little too late, obliging others to act perhaps even more boldly, more dramatically, with higher risk later. So I don't think the world stops in 2050. None of you believe it'll stop in 2050. And we can't deliver a carbon budget that looks good on the 31st of December 2050, but essentially sets us up to fail in the decades that follow.
Councillor White. You're on mute, Tito.
Can you hear me now?
Again.
Yeah, kia ora, Dr. Carr. Enjoyed your presentation. I'm really intrigued for the future generations because I read an article that said by the time my mokopuna who's born today reaches 70, the tides, the water would have risen nearly 3/4 of a metre, the temperature would be changed significantly, and life as we knew it with certain weather storms and everything else will hit us. That's the world. And I just want to comment about Councillor Rose. I mean, in 70 years' time, he may still be around. The rest of us around this table won't be, I would doubt. So we are talking about their generation, and I'm interested in trying to picture this in the global context now. You mentioned New Zealand, very small, 0.1% of 1% global emissions, but we want to promote legitimacy. So my question really then is that, and I want to look at this big picture globally. New Zealand has, I would dare to say, has led the sort of the COVID response globally. You know, they looked at the rest of the world as being this fantastic country that has done really well. In this particular respect, the work that you're doing in mission, how is that seen globally? Or is it seen globally? You know, because we're taking a leadership role in this space. What's your view on that? Because I'd like to think that there is some sort of global cohesion.
I think the answer to that is, unfortunately, we are not a leader. The UK created a climate change commission more than a decade ago. So there are now 22 countries in the world with legislation a little like, not entirely like, a little like our legislation. There are countries that have reduced their greenhouse gas emissions below their 1990 level, and we are not one of them. There are countries that have managed to lock in a downward trend for their greenhouse gas emissions for a series of years in a row. We are not one of them. There are countries that are making very substantial commitments and investments in new technologies. We are not one of them. So the question for New Zealand is, we are a little late to this party. We essentially lost a decade. The challenge for us is now, what is our part in catching up, and where can we role model behaviour that, if adopted by others, would make the world a better, safer place? And that is my great hope for our agricultural sector, because the agricultural sector is very important to New Zealand, and it is very important to the world that we find effective ways of creating protein that do not contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. And in the agricultural sector, there is every reason to believe that New Zealand has the right incentives, motivation, science and technical skills to find pathways that could be adopted by other larger greenhouse gas emitting agricultural communities. So I think we will need to look to the world to develop some of the electrification technologies and the hydrogen technologies, but I think we should expect that we play a significant role in agricultural emissions management and reduction.
Thank you, Dr. Carr. Just one final point, Mr. Chair. I do like his comment, the final principle you mentioned, that how we measure the success of economic recovery, you know, in terms of the well-being. And I'm sort of very mindful that that's one of the planks that regional councils and TLAs have to consider in the context of the government's foreign moves and pushes forward.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Carr, for a very insightful and competent presentation. And in closing, could I just suggest that we will monitor and seek your advice in terms of what we do as a regional entity going forward, because this is not a position where we should do it in respective silos. I mean, you've got a lot of capacity and capability in the person sitting around your table, and we need to draw on that as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for the leadership you're showing among regional governments and the work you've been doing. Sure.
Thank you.